Hi, and welcome to everyone joining us for our second and final episode in our series on creating a thinking environment. If you haven't had the opportunity to watch part 1 yet, I highly encourage you to do so. In part 1, Soshan and I covered the first 5 principles in Nancy Klein's Time to Think. Those principles being giving attention, showing appreciation, offering encouragement, creating a sense of ease during engagement, and creating equality. In today's episode, we will cover the remaining principles. So, without further ado, help me in welcoming back Soshan Subramanian. Soshan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Shamil. I feel very welcome.
No, that's great. I'm so appreciative of you sharing your knowledge and perspectives on these principles. I think since the last time we had the session, so much I could feel like a shift in myself, just in trying to implement some of the principles in not just in my workplace, but in everyday conversation. And I think before we start delving into the principles, that we're going to cover today, I just want to highlight for everyone out there and almost emphasize that these principles can be applied to everyday conversations. I don't know if you agree with that, and what your experience has been like with these principles. Do you want to maybe just touch on that, and then we can get into the content for today?
Absolutely. I think they are definitely things that you could do every day. For me personally, after I've learned about the thinking environment, I don't think I have been the same person. I absolutely make mistakes. I absolutely interrupt people on the daily because it is hard work to remember and to practice. But the awareness has changed the type of spouse I am, the type of parent I am, the type of teacher I am. So I do think that it really is, it's a model for being in conversation with somebody.
100% agreed with that. And like you're saying, it is hard work, but hopefully, with us having this conversation and putting it on this platform, we're creating the awareness, right, which is so important. So thank you for coming through, and I'm really excited about our second part of this series. So the first principle I want to cover today with you and just have a conversation about is welcoming feelings, right? Or bringing emotion to the table, right? I think so often it's not, it's almost like an unspoken rule, and again, context is important, but we are told, or it's strongly suggested sometimes that we leave emotion out of the conversation, okay? And that's why I say context is important, but we steer towards more logical thinking, right, sometimes. But in your experience, what role does emotion have in a conversation?
So maybe I should start by saying this is the component that I am working on the most for myself. It is the one that I'm struggling with the most in some sense, because so much of our training and the way we have subtly been taught to conform to the environments that we are a part of, so much of that conditioning has been actually to suppress true feelings. So many of us, certainly in my childhood, things that were kind of validated and rewarded were when you were outspoken, or when you were showing bravery, or when you were, showing courage, or when you were achieving something, right? I can't remember somebody ever telling me as a child, I'm really proud of you for saying that you're feeling really sad. I'm really proud of you for acknowledging that you're feeling so angry about the situation, because that is something to be truly proud of. And I can't help but wonder if in my life people were saying those kind of things, that I would have, adopted a different approach to truly welcoming my feelings. So, with that being said, I think in many conversations in our organizations today, you could argue that many of the contexts in which decisions are made are actually devoid of genuine feeling, of people truly bringing what they feel to the table. And, in thinking through this conversation, I was wondering, if we had to sit down and redesign the way our banks are working, our insurance companies are working, and I'm saying this because we come from a world of financial services. If we could, sit down and design how our economy should be run and how our people are interacting with the wealth that is in the country and how they are contributing to it and sharing in it and kind of rejoicing in it, would we design the systems, the organizations, the meeting agendas that we are currently experiencing in the world? And so I'm really interested in this question of, if we had to truly allow all our feelings into the conversation, would we create a better world? Would we create a different world? So talking about its importance, it's something that I feel I can't, estimate how important it is. That I can't underestimate how important it is, because I think when true feelings are welcomed, then we accept a fuller view of reality. And then the core kind of thinking in this work and the core finding is that when we release emotions, we allow our thinking to be restored. We allow ourselves to think with our full bodies. Yeah.
I think you've covered that so well, Soshin, and I really love the question that you've been pondering. Like, would we, maybe not even just in the workplace, but if you have to think about our own lives, and it's probably changed over time. But if you've got this opportunity right now to redesign the way you think, the way you speak and listen and act, right, and engage as well. Like, just by us having this conversation, I think it's an opportunity for people to think about their current, design, and then really look at that. And I sometimes wonder, like, that you shared, when you were growing up, not many people, if any, said, Soshin, you're such an angry child. Like, I'm so proud that you're acknowledging those feelings. I think I can relate to that 100%, right? It's always been very, when you talk about your feelings, it is always, spoken of from a negative perspective. Why are you angry? Don't be angry, be happy. It's almost conditioning you. I like the word you use, conditioning you to suppress feelings. And then as you grow up, that conditioning remains, and you start wondering, oh, if I put my true feelings on the table, now we're in wherever, the boardroom, you're in the classroom, if I put my true feelings on the table, it's almost seen like a problem. It's people are going to judge me, and we spoke about judgment and offering encouragement and all of those things in part one. And yeah, so I just wonder, over time, if we can shift again towards a world where we can sort of table our feelings, and it's okay, it's not seen as a sign of weakness, right? I think oftentimes when you talk about feelings, and I don't want to sound like sexist or anything, but from a male perspective, I think it's very commonly known, if you talk about your feelings, you often seen as less of a being. Sometimes you're not supposed to cry. So hopefully you've definitely offered some food for thought for people on this principle of feelings. So thank you for that. And I think it leads on quite nicely to the next principle, which is celebrating divergent thinking. Right? How do we actually go about? I don't think we spoke about it much, but how do we actually go about celebrating divergent thinking? Okay, we spoke about encouraging divergent thinking, but if somebody, okay, maybe take one step back. What is divergent thinking? And how can we embrace that thinking?
Yeah. Just going back to something you said about the boys thing is that, I cringe every time somebody says to my son, "Oh, boys don't cry," or, "Don't cry, you're not a girl," or something like that. I mean, there's so many problems with that statement, right? And I think, yeah, we could we could spend an entire podcast talking about why that statement in particular is so problematic. But just on that point around, nowadays my son's 5 years old, so nowadays I'm kind of around parents of 5-year-olds quite often, and just this observation that I had about how prevalent this is in terms of just wanting to stop a child from crying, right? And Nancy actually writes in many of her books why we seem to have structured society around stopping this very natural response of our bodies. And yet for many other responses, we have lots of tools and, things to support it and accommodate it and nurture, and encourage us in those moments. But when it comes to crying, we feel like stop the crying and then you'll stop the pain. And so I often ask the question to parents or to people I'm teaching a thinking environment to, that if you knew your child was becoming more intelligent while they were crying, how would you be with them? Because really, it is easy to fathom that if they're doing something so natural as expressing their emotion, they are allowing themselves to think more fully. So just your comment made me think about that. Now coming to your question of this component of difference, which is where your question of divergent thinking is coming from. The mind thinks best in the presence of reality. And reality is not this homogeneous set of things where everyone looks the same and everyone thinks the same. And so if we want to be more connected to reality, we need to be more connected to the difference around us. And so that's one way to think about the need to celebrate when you have a quiet person in the room, contributing to a conversation, and even maybe how to celebrate it, because again, it's a topic that we spoke about in part 1, but just even listening to somebody is a huge form of appreciation to them. So even creating structure and designing the way we convene around how to make sure that different voices are heard, and even taking a look at ourselves and say, what might we be assuming here that's actually limiting our ability to get different viewpoints into the room. So it isn't a secret that in many organizations, I guess around the world, but in South Africa, we have a particular phenomenon of, the higher up, you get, or the closer you get to decision makers, the paler, older, kind of more male the room starts to look. In my profession, I may have mentioned this the last time, but in my profession, we have kind of the highest academic qualification, which is to be a fellow of the Actuarial Society of South Africa. We still have about 73% of that membership being white male. And so, and we are working on the problem. So I don't think, the society as a whole is in denial about the problem, but I do think many of its members are in denial that, that we could not be as good an actuarial profession if we are sitting with a completely homogeneous or largely homogeneous group of decision makers in the profession. So I can't help but think that it's, how much better, how much more connected we could be to reality if we had actuaries who are, not only representative of the society we're serving, but is more connected to the issues of the society that we are serving. So I think that is my, freshest thinking around your question of the need to celebrate. And how to celebrate is an interesting question. And I think a good starting point would be to welcome different views and to listen in a way that says to them, your view really matters here.
Thanks for raising, that and sharing your views on the subject. This, coming back to this idea of divergent thinking and celebrating diversity. I think in South Africa, and I've mentioned this on one of my very first, second episodes, of how fortunate I think we are, right, to be in a country where we've got so many people from so many different backgrounds, only because it serves as an opportunity to do so much better, right? I think the struggle is, how do we get enough people in a room that we can go and solve the problem holistically? So if I have to think about this podcast, and it's something I struggle with, and I don't feel like everybody has the means to access, podcasts. Yes, it's on YouTube, right, which is for free. It's on all these platforms. It's on, my podcast is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's even on a few international platforms. But if we have to think about South Africa, right, how many people, one, have access to any of those platforms? Two, how important is it for them to go and listen to a podcast? And how do we go about changing that? So just something for people to think about. And I mean, it's something I'm thinking about, definitely.
Well, maybe just one thought is that, wow, to that question, because it's something I hadn't thought about, even in doing things like, agreeing to do podcasts and things like that. I never thought about, well, who can actually access it? And that's such a powerful point. The story that I'm thinking about now is one of my actuarial science teachers, who is now a collaborator of mine in researching how can we make the actuarial education system more trauma sensitive and trauma informed, more expansive and generative. A few years ago, she was interested in getting the thinking environment into her organization. And she, one day, an email from her appeared in my mailbox, and it said, do you have a POC teacher of the thinking environment that we could use? And I kind of immediately clicked that, okay, Shivani's asking for a person of color, right? But it's the first time that I'd been invited in that way to say, well, actually, like, wow, to this email. And I think it taught me three things now that I'm thinking about it. The one thing was that you can actually be very intentional about bringing diversity and difference into the room. So, and it isn't a surprise to me that, Shivani Ranchod, the person I'm talking about, has created these companies that are doing mind-blowing kind of innovation in the world. And just like it, in retrospect, makes so much sense that she would be actively looking for somebody more connected to the real societal issues and the change that she wants to see in the world. So, yay. The other thing it just drew my attention to was that, okay, do we have this out there? Are there people who are learning the thinking environment that are people of color, that know better, know better things and more things about people's lives, many people's lives that we don't know, or that many of the time to think practitioners don't know? And finally, it was just such a lesson in courage that actually, if we are going to change society, then I need to be brave enough and say, well, actually, the space is missing something. Can you help me bring it into the space? And so I feel like it was just such a beautiful invitation. So your story made me think about that lovely story.
It's awesome. I'm glad. Let's move on to the third principle we want to cover today, right? And that's this idea of providing information in a conversation. It sounds so formal when I say it out loud, but it's this idea of having a conversation, sharing your views, in other words, sharing information. At some point, and maybe you can touch on this, and I'll phrase it differently. At what point does it become too much information where you're no longer stimulating the conversation and igniting thinking, but you're shutting down the conversation and shutting down thinking?
Yeah, it's a very kind of multi-layered question, because there's so many things about information that are very subtle. Sometimes we think we're helping somebody just by giving them more and more more and more information. We think we're encouraging, we think we're being supportive. I think the key driver and a very important question would be, what is the reason for us to say what we want to say, and in choosing when we want to say it? What is the reason for it? Is it, for example, to show that I'm here and I'm on the ball and, look at me, how much I know? Is it genuinely in service of the thinking of the other person? So when should I say something is a very important question. How should I say it? How much do I need to say in order for the other person to continue to think well? And those are very important questions. So even in my role as a teacher, for example, in my university role, I often ask myself the question in this lecture: how much information do my students need, and when, in order for them to think well about this topic? And I think the answers might surprise you if you really, dig quite deep into that question. So that's the one thing I can say about your question. The other thing is that obviously withholding information is quite unfair, and not conducive to good thinking, because you're kind of manipulating the conversation in some way. And on the other hand, not asking for information that you need is also reckless. So the intellectual rigor around information can be get the right amount, kind of appreciate all the relevant facts, ask for it when you don't have it, handle it with care when you are giving it to somebody. I recall in one of the books, Nancy Klein describes it as a craving. When you find out there's something that somebody doesn't know, it's this craving that, I need to correct you, I need to stop you, I need to. And she draws a lot of awareness around, when do you need to come in with that information, and how can it be done in such a way that it does not deflect attention onto me, but continues to be in the best interests of your own thinking. Yeah,
that's amazing. I think thank you for sharing. I think you've given us practical advice there by just saying, how much information and when, so that someone can think well. And I just want to quickly highlight that, because as you were talking, a few things ran through my mind of how this can be applied to life and like every day. One is in the workplace when, you're presenting something. I think so often it's easy not only for the presenter, but even for the audience to forget this principle, right? Everyone is so eager to ask questions, about the content that's being presented. But I think just this idea of how much, when, so that people can think well, would change, the way I go about presenting as well. If I have to think about studying, right? Because I mean, you're down in the trenches. But if I have to think about how I go about studying as well, and I never thought about this until you just mentioned those three things. Because often we're told, okay, you need to study a subject, and okay, cool, there's different, schools of thought on how you should go about studying. But for yourself, imagine if you could sit down and say, okay, there's this chapter, okay, but how much of this content, so again, the how much of this content should I, take in right now so that I can think well, you know? I think that's going to be so powerful for me as well. Yeah. Any other thoughts that are triggered for you before we move on to incisive questions?
No, that's just amazing. I didn't think about that. That's a great observation, because I can also apply that in my life. How much look, actually, the one thing it is triggering for me is that in my world where I teach actuarial science students, there's often this compulsion to be perfect and precise. And very often, I had one of these obstacles in my own studies, is that we feel that we need to be so conceptually well versed in the topic that we become afraid to try stuff. So we feel, we need to really, really master this before we even try. And if we try something and get it wrong, then we are bad. Then we're not meant to be actuarial, studying actuarial science. We're not meant to be actuaries, or I'm not a good actuary because I'm not as technical as this other person. Again, you can kind of see all these limiting assumptions start to infuse the study environment. But that is something that is quite interesting, is that I never thought about that information could actually help overcome this fear of failure by pacing it and understanding, how can the information not become overwhelming. And in a way, choosing to get stuff wrong is a way of saying, actually, I'm giving myself more information. Because when I get something wrong, I become more aware of where the gaps in my knowledge are. And studies of metacognition say that when students become more aware of where the gaps are, they become quicker and more efficient at closing those gaps. So it's quite, it's quite a lot to ask a student to say, get as much stuff wrong as possible. Sometimes I even say in my lectures, can I get a wrong answer here?
I think people underestimate that, though, right? I think people underestimate exactly that last point. This fear of failure, and not having the courage to fail and to say the wrong thing, give the wrong answer. Whether it's as a parent to your child, a lecturer to your students, in the boardroom to the board or the committee, whoever's sitting there. We're so conditioned to get it right all the time. And hopefully just, us having this conversation, and to everyone listening, hopefully it brings, awareness. So again, I want to highlight the word awareness, because that's what we're trying to do here on this platform. And secondly, and you mentioned it in your response earlier on, but it's also about intention, right? This idea of how much information you give, and even this idea of asking questions. Are you doing it from an ego perspective, right? So what is your intention? So awareness and intention, things, two things I want the listeners just to take note of. And yeah, I think let's get into the fourth and final, point of discussion today, which is this idea of incisive questions. Okay, I'd like you to maybe break down at its core, right? What is this idea of what is an incisive question? And perhaps you can couple that with, how do we go about constructing, an incisive question?
Great. Before I answer that, just to mention that there would be 5 today, because there's also the place.
Yes,
Place,
the environment.
Yeah.
You're right.
So, an incisive question. In general, questions ignite thinking. So when the mind hears a question, automatically it starts to fire up, right? So something gets triggered when questions are asked. Now, very often, what might be stopping us from achieving our goals are the assumptions that we make about ourselves, about life. We could be making many types of assumptions, but very often the things that are really stopping us, Nancy describes as these bedrock assumptions. So they're so deeply rooted that you could almost think that we've been living with them for so long, they've almost become like a belief, So an incisive question is an example of a question that essentially takes away that assumption that's limiting our lives and replaces it. So it invites the mind to consider an alternative thing that is real and also liberating. So the best way is through an example that I could describe it. So let's say my son, Caden, comes to me and says he's got a question about the planets, because that's what he asks a lot of questions about the planets these days. And let's suppose he says that he can't ask his teacher the question. And I ask him why. And suppose he says, well, I'm not a scientist. I can't think like a scientist, right? There's a subtle difference between each of these two assumptions. But you could very easily determine that second assumption of I can't think like a scientist, which is probably the one that's truly holding him back from asking this question. I'm too stupid to ask the question. That's another way of, I'm too ignorant to ask the question. But this thing about I can't think like a scientist is clearly an untrue assumption, right? Yes, he might not have a degree in science, but him saying I can't think like a scientist would be categorically untrue. Logically, it would not I would not be able to prove that he cannot think like a scientist. Neither would he. But it's clearly stopping him. Now, in an everyday conversation, we might be tempted to say, no, just ask, you can think like a scientist, just do it. And then somebody probably goes like, okay, fine. And then their likelihood of actually doing it, nothing's really shifted in them. But if you invite a possibility, this beautiful thing that Nancy Klein has kind of discovered and unearthed is this ability to embed an alternative assumption into a question. So, for example, I could ask him, if you knew you were brilliant, what question would you ask the teacher? Or, if you knew that all of us are discovering things about the planets, what questions would you like to ask tomorrow? There are many. And if we could get him to even come up with what is the liberating assumption for his life, even better. But just that ability to take away that untrue assumption that's limiting him, replace it with something that is true. If you knew that I think you have a brilliant questioning mind that's always coming up with amazing big questions for me, what would change for you? What would you ask? So that's an incisive question. Absolutely, exquisite thing.
It is. I think I'm lost for words. You've just flipped the script. I think it's so profound, and it's this idea is got me thinking as well, just about the way I ask questions, and it's this idea of limiting assumptions. I think we underestimate that in our own lives as well, and I often wonder how much of those assumptions, obviously most of them are not probably true, but we believe them to be true because of the society we live in. And again, it comes back then to this idea of confidence and courage. Do you have the confidence in yourself and the courage to remove those assumptions, those limiting beliefs, right? Because you might not always be in a position where somebody can do that for you, like you do for your son. And I guess the hope is that people start working towards that, right? And it is a journey. But I think what you've highlighted in this example that you've given is that if you do that, I mean, just the way you phrased it already for myself, I was like, I want to say damn, but like, wow, Soshin, if you, and I want to repeat the question you asked, and I might be paraphrasing now, but you said, what if I told you you had the most like brilliant, inquisitive mind? How would you ask the question? And that is gold, right? And you can apply it to so much in your life. So thank you for that nugget. It's amazing. Let's talk about bringing all of this together now in the last principle. I think it actually is such a nice, principle to bring everything together. As you mentioned, is the environment. And I think I want to ask or have a conversation about two elements or dimensions of the environment. One is about control, because we don't always have control over the environment we're in. How do we bring these principles that we've discussed now into that environment, or or into this environment where we don't have a lot of control over? And two, if we do have control over the environment, how do we implement or practice these principles? And I'll come back to the second question because it's probably like loaded. The questions are loaded. So let's maybe break it down. Let's tackle the first one. We don't always have control over our environment. How do we then practice or bring these principles into play?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the first thing is to understand what is this component of place. So place, and I love the way Nancy Kline describes it, because she gives this contrast of this like hot boiler room, right, where people struggle to think in this, in this very closed up, place that is clearly stopping the thinking. But then she also describes this, the enormity and vastness of this big Banks building that's full of beautiful sunlight and big plants and designer furniture, and that's like, in saying that, she describes how it occurred to her that it's not just the amount of sunlight and the amount of greenery that's there. It was actually the kind of discovery that she didn't feel that she mattered in either of those two places. And so the thing about that makes a place conducive to good thinking, according to these components of a thinking environment, would be whether or not the place says to you, you matter here. And another big aspect of that is actually in the listener themselves, because the eyes of the listener, the face of the listener, is sending many, many signals to the thinker around the quality of this place, around how much you matter here. And then coming back to your question of when you don't have control over the physical setting, that is a really good thing to be aware of. And I think in the context that I've worked in, some of the things that I've thought about is, okay, so if we are stuck in a room without air, or without enough ventilation or without enough light, could we take more frequent breaks? Could we shift some parts of the conversation to other settings? Could we work in smaller groups where they are a little bit more comfortable? So if we're all sitting in a U shape with tables in one room, could we break out into the where some people sit on a couch in the next room? So I think even when we don't have direct control over the physical container, there are many questions we could ask, such as, how could we make this place more inviting? What could the welcoming into the place look like? How could we show our appreciation, yeah.
No, I think that answers it really well. So again, really appreciative of you sharing that, because it's something I didn't think about up until now. And even this idea that you just mentioned about the boiler room and this, let's call it a very fancy, building or environment. And it got me thinking, you might not always have control over the outside environment, but something you do, or I'd like to think that you have control over, is that inside environment, the one, that is inside of you. And it touches on some of these elements we spoke of today. This intention, the awareness, the courage, confidence, the ego, all of that is, sitting inside, and you do have some control over that. And when you walk into a place, you might not have control over the setting, but you do have control over that inner setting. And it's because you have control over it, you can probably put your best foot forward, right? No matter the physical environment. But again, I'm saying this like it's easy. I know firsthand it's something that takes practice. And then just going back to the second question, and it might be a bit of an easier one, but I want to bring it to the conversation so that people have an idea of how to go about practicing, these principles. In your experience, because I think you've at least had a lot more firsthand experience, and you've known these principles a lot longer than I have. If somebody wanted to, there's 10 principles that we've covered. The obvious question is, okay, so the next time I have a conversation, whether it's with my spouse, my child, my peer, colleague, do I need to bring all 10 to the table? And that in itself can be very overwhelming. Okay, so how do we go about now bringing all of this together? How do you go about practicing these principles?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's a very important one. Maybe just to say on the component of place, the body of the thinker is also a big part of the place. So what's happening internally in the body of the thinker is also very important. So have they been nourished, right? Have they eaten? So simple things about whether their internal place is also at a level of comfort that will allow them to sustain and generate and sustain good thinking. So that is another aspect of place. Now, to your question of where do we start? I don't think any of these components are things that we don't intuitively know. I think with all of this stuff, we could look back and say, oh yeah, well, if I treat someone, give them courage instead of competing with them, I can pretty easily conclude that that's going to lead to a better outcome for them. So it's, and I love what Nancy Klein recently wrote, is that it's not that we want to turn the world into a thinking environment, we want to return it to a thinking environment. So I can't help but think that so much of this deep wisdom is already in our heritage, in our culture, in our connection with humanity and with the planet. And so a big part of this would, I think, just be, a simple start would be, can we just connect a bit more with ourselves? Can we start to be a place of ease? Because if we can get ourselves to a place of ease, like, for example, I mentioned the work I'm doing on just learning how to welcome feelings a bit more. And I work with a therapist who actually, often reminds me, you're feeling irritation here, but it's easier to feel that irritation if you're not truly welcoming the painful feeling. So, what is the real hurt? What is the real pain? And I think just by learning how to be more connected with that, we will become interested in how can we get the best thinking of others, and we'll become less interested in trying to create environments that prove our worth or that prove our intelligence, or trying to take on actions that make us want to achieve certain things in order to feel good, and rather just be interested in how we can meet, how we can be with each other in such a way that we genuinely appreciate, ignite thinking because of this awareness of what our attention can do. So I think if you're reading about these 10 components, they take a lot of practice. So even just practicing one at a time, any one thing can make a massive difference. And I think, when you start to play with the one thing, you say, I've got this down. Let me now try this other thing. And I think there's a lot to be said of just unpacking them and saying, what is the thing that I really want to work on that I think, could really help me connect a bit more with myself. So that's how I approach it, and that would be, my suggestion of how to go about doing it.
Well, that's awesome. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about connection. Connection with yourself firstly, and then maybe intuitively it becomes a lot easier then to connect with others. But the starting point is to connect with yourself. And I think I mentioned it in episode 1. So thank you so much for, bringing that back, and for, again, reminding us that we don't need to go and tackle all 10, at the same time. Just take one that you feel is going to make the most impact for yourself, going to allow you to connect with, your inner being, has the most impact on that, and so that you can go out there and be impactful when you're connecting and engaging with others. So Shin, these 2 episodes, I think we could sit and have a conversation for days, and I think it's testament to creating a thinking environment. I want to highlight to the listeners out there that, a lot of this isn't planned, right? And even for myself, just having this conversation with you, you've ignited these questions, spur of the moment, and it's fresh thinking, and it's testament to the 10 principles. And we've tried to incorporate that, and I think intuitively, naturally, in this conversation. So I hope it changes, the way people speak, think, listen, engage with one another. It's certainly shifted a lot for myself. So, genuinely, thank you so much for that, and bringing my attention to these 10 principles. Is there any parting thoughts from your side?
Maybe one thing, I was aware of it probably because of this podcast. So today I'll tell a little story about my son again. So my 5-year-old son, Caden, I was playing with him today, and he has this little bunny teddy bear. And he says, did you know Bun Bun's in preschool now? I said, okay, who's Bun Bun's teacher? So again, just randomly asking questions, not really thinking it's going to create a profound experience for me. And he says, you're the teacher. So then I said, and I think I had this podcast in the back of my mind. And I decided to ask him, okay, what would make me a good teacher to Bun Bun? So this bunny's name is Bun Bun. And he says 3 things very confidently. He says, give her, you got to make lunch for her and give her as much carrot spaghetti as she wants. The second thing is that you've got to tell her when it's lunchtime and where to go, and when it's time to go into the pool, when it's time to eat, when it's time to go to the pool. Mm-hmm. And finally, you have to make sure that her friends listen to her so that she feels special. And I was like, wow, okay, so you've got this structured environment full of internal nourishment and soaked in attention of others. So that's just a nice little nugget to say this wisdom lives everywhere, even in my 5-year-old son, whose expression of what a good teacher is so consistent with creating a thinking environment. So I think maybe my parting thought is that this is known to us. It's innate in us, and I think the world is calling for it. and a child grows up expecting it. Yeah.
Brilliant, Soshin. Thank you so much for sharing that story. In closing, I want to highlight so your son, I mean, that's really some profound wisdom right there. But it sparks this idea that we can all go out there and be that teacher, right? And be that coach, no matter the setting. And it's amazing that it's coming from your son. So we get to put that on this platform as well, which is brilliant. I love it. Thank you so much, Soshin. And again, thank you for sharing your views and perspectives on Nancy Klein's Time to Think, Creating a Thinking Environment. 2-part episode wrapped up. This is brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for this beautiful attention and the space that's been created for these conversations. I think it's going to have a very deep impact in people's lives.
Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Soshin.
Great.